When you think about the Age of Enlightenment, there's one name that just seems to capture the entire century: Voltaire. He was a writer, a philosopher, a rebel, really a kind of rock star of his day, whose wit was as sharp as his ideas were revolutionary. So let's peel back the layers and get to know the real man behind the myth.
Okay, so this is the quote, right? The one everybody knows. It's the perfect soundbite for a champion of free speech. It has inspired activists and thinkers for centuries. I mean, it's the absolute essence of Voltaire. Isn't it?
Yeah, you heard me. The most famous thing Voltaire ever said, he never actually said it. That line was written by his biographer, a woman named Evelyn Beatrice Hall, almost 130 years after he died. It was her summary of his attitude. So if we want to understand the real Voltaire and his actual impact, we've got to look past the legend.
And that journey starts with his real name, François-Marie Arouet. Voltaire, believe it or not, was a pen name he picked up after a little stay in prison. So who was this guy before he became a symbol?
Well, from a young age, François-Marie was a total star in the Parisian salons. He was brilliant, he was charming, and he was armed with a razor-sharp wit. The only problem? He loved aiming that wit at the most powerful people in France. He wrote a satirical verse suggesting the ruler of France was having an affair with his own daughter, and, surprise, surprise, that landed him right in the infamous Bastille prison for 11 months. And this would become a bit of a pattern.
And this is where the story really takes a turn. See, it's one thing to make fun of the system from a fancy salon. It's something else entirely to feel its boot on your neck. A series of personal injustices were about to transform him from a clever poet into a full-blown revolutionary thinker.
Okay, so let's walk through this because this part is absolutely crucial. In 1726, a really arrogant nobleman, the Chevalier de Rohan, insults him. Voltaire, who never backs down, fires back with some witty comeback. A few days later, Rohan's goons ambush Voltaire in the street and beat him with sticks. Voltaire is furious. He demands a duel. That's the honorable way to settle things. But for a commoner to challenge a nobleman, the Rohan family just pulls some strings, has Voltaire arrested, and thrown back in the Bastille. No trial, no questions. His only way out was to agree to be exiled from France.
And that exile? It turned out to be a total game changer. It absolutely blew his mind. In England, he discovered a society that was just shocking to a Frenchman. He saw a monarchy where the king's power was actually limited by a parliament. He saw dozens of different religious groups living together, more or less in peace. He saw freedom of speech that was totally unthinkable back home. He even saw scientists like Isaac Newton being treated like royalty, honored for their minds, not their bloodline.
So, naturally, he writes a book about it. Letters Concerning the English Nation was basically a love letter to English liberty, which also made it a giant slap in the face to the French system. And you can probably guess how well that went over back in France. The book was declared a scandal, it was publicly burned by the state executioner, and a warrant was put out for Voltaire's arrest. He had to flee Paris yet again.
Voltaire had learned his lesson the hard way. Trying to fight the state head-on was a losing battle. From this point on, his weapon of choice was going to be his mind, and his battlefield was going to be the printed page.
And what a weapon it was. I mean, the man was an absolute machine. We are talking over 2,000 books and pamphlets, not to mention more than 20,000 personal letters. He wrote plays, poems, history, philosophy, science. He was basically a one-man intellectual army.
And it wasn't just all sharp-tongued satire. He was also a brilliant popularizer of ideas. He took the incredibly complex, world-changing work of Isaac Newton and broke it down so the average person in France could understand it. He was helping to kickstart the Age of Reason for everyone.
As he got older, his fight became laser-focused, boiled down into a single powerful motto that he would sign off his letters with: "Écrasez l'infâme," crush the infamous thing.
So, what was this infamous thing he was so fired up about? Well, for him, it was everything holding humanity back. It was religious fanaticism, it was the abuse of power by the church and the monarchy, it was superstition that got in the way of reason. This became his life's mission. And in his later years, this mission wasn't just about abstract philosophy anymore. It was about fighting for real people, for the real victims of the infamous thing. He basically became a public defender for the unjustly accused.
The most famous case by far was the Calas affair. Jean Calas was a Protestant in a very Catholic town. When his son was found dead, rumors started flying that Calas had murdered him to stop him from becoming Catholic.
There was zero evidence, just anti-Protestant hysteria. But Calas was found guilty, brutally tortured on the breaking wheel, and then executed. When Voltaire heard about this, he was absolutely enraged. He launched a 3-year public relations campaign, writing articles and letters to influential people all over Europe. He used his international fame to shine a massive spotlight on this horrific injustice. Until finally, in 1765, the verdict was overturned. He cleared the family's name, he proved that a writer's pen could actually change the world.
But, and this is a really big but, Voltaire was no saint, not by a long shot. He was a complex, contradictory, and honestly, often a pretty difficult man. To really get him, you have to look at the whole picture.
I mean, the guy could be a terrible friend. He had this huge falling out with Frederick the Great of Prussia that ended with Voltaire getting detained by the king's men. And his feud with fellow philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau was legendary. After reading Rousseau's work praising the natural state of humanity, Voltaire shot back that it made one want to get down and walk on all fours.
And, some of his views are just really tough to swallow from our modern perspective. He held prejudiced views on race and religion, writing some pretty awful things about Judaism and Islam. And for all his talk about liberty, he was no fan of democracy. He thought the masses were basically ignorant, and that real change could only come from the top, from an enlightened king who would listen to reason, a king who, of course, would probably listen to philosophers like him.
And yet, despite all of his flaws, when the French Revolution finally erupted, its leaders saw Voltaire as their spiritual father. In 1791, they moved his body to the Pantheon, the great tomb for France's heroes, honoring him as a man who taught the nation what it meant to be free. Because his lifelong fight for civil rights, for a fair trial, for religious tolerance, that was the legacy that really mattered.
So maybe he never said that perfect pithy quote about defending speech to the death. But in a way, he didn't have to. He lived it. He fought for reason over superstition, for tolerance over fanaticism, for justice over tyranny. He spent his entire life trying to crush the infamous thing. Which kind of leaves us with one last question to think about, doesn't it? What's the infamous thing of our time? And who's willing to fight it?